Hello everyone, this is Medical Gateway, and today we're going to study cell membrane. This is Guyton chapter number 2, part 2. Okay, so cell membrane, this is a very high yield topic. Cell membrane basically consists of three things: the proteins, the lipids, and the carbohydrates. Now, the lipids are present in the form of phospholipids, cholesterol, and other lipids. So, this is the cell membrane. Here you can see the proteins, the big ones, the integral proteins, and these are the integral protein. This is the integral proteins which are running through and through the cell membrane. And then on the inside, there are peripheral proteins. Okay, and these outside the cell membrane are the carbohydrates. And the lipids are basically this lipid bilayer. One is this layer of lipids and the other is this layer of lipids. These are basically phospholipids. Okay, so proteins are 55%, carbohydrates are 3%, lipids, there are three types of lipids in the cell membrane. One is phospholipid, other one is cholesterol, and then there are a few other lipids. So phospholipids are, which make the bilayer, they are 25%, and cholesterol is 13%, and other lipids consist of 4%. Okay. So let's move on towards the proteins. Now, proteins, there are two types of proteins: integral proteins and peripheral proteins. As previously discussed, these through and through running proteins are the integral proteins, and on the inside of these integral proteins, there are the peripheral proteins. Okay? Now, integral proteins. What is the function of these integral proteins? Integral proteins can act as channels or pores, they can act as carrier proteins, and they can act as receptors. Okay, now, channels or pores? Okay, anything which is not lipid soluble or which is water soluble cannot pass through this lipid bilayer of cell membrane. So how the water soluble things and the water itself, how they can enter the cell membrane, how they can pass through the cell membrane? They will pass through the cell membrane via these integral proteins, because these integral proteins act as channels or pores. So integral proteins acting as channel or pores, so water and water soluble substances can pass through them. Okay, the second one is the integral proteins can act as carrier proteins. Okay, now carrier proteins, these integral proteins act as carrier proteins, especially in the case of active transport. When there is requirement of energy to push something from an area of low concentration towards high concentration, there these proteins are used. There these integral proteins are used, and they will be defined as carrier proteins in that case, because they carry substances, and it is basically the case of active transport. Then integral proteins can also act as receptors. Okay, now when they act as receptors, there are 2 to 3 things which happen to them. Number one is they go through conformational changes, and the other two mechanisms are something is attached to the outside of the integral proteins, because they are now acting as receptors. When something is attached to the outside of these integral proteins, there will be two things. Number one, they will activate intracellular protein parts. So these intracellular protein parts are activated, which act as enzymes and which can move reactions in different directions. Okay, and the second one is the famous second messenger system. When they're acting as receptors, something is attached to them on the outside, the inside of them will activate the second messenger system. So by this way, integral proteins can act as, number one, the channels or pores for water and water soluble substances, the carrier proteins for active transport, and they can also act as receptors by conformational change, by activating intracellular protein part, and by second messenger system activation. Okay, the other one is integral protein, the other one is the peripheral protein. The peripheral proteins are the ones which are inside. Okay, now peripheral proteins are basically attached to the integral proteins on the inside. Now they can act as enzymes, and they also control the transport via the integral proteins. We have discussed earlier that they activate when integral proteins act as receptors, they activate intracellular protein part. Okay, Now, these peripheral proteins get activated, which are functioning as enzymes. And secondly, whenever they are acting as the channels or pores, these channels or pores are gated inside by the peripheral proteins, which control the transport through the integral proteins. So these are the two important functions of peripheral proteins. Number one, they act as enzymes, and secondly, they act as controller of transport. Okay, so these were the functions of proteins in the cell membrane. Now let's discuss the functions of lipids. Okay, now there are three types of lipids present in the cell membrane. One is the phospholipid, the famous phospholipid, which will make the lipid bilayer. Then we have sphingolipids, and then we have cholesterol. Okay, now phospholipids, as the name says, it is made from phosphate and lipids. Okay, now let's see this diagram. Let's zoom it. Okay, now this is the lipid bilayer as labeled here. One is this layer and the other one is this layer. Now these round ones are the phosphates, and inside the phosphate is attached the lipids. Now this is phosphate, this is another phosphate, this is another phosphate, and with phosphate is attached the lipid. So this is one phospholipid, and these phospholipids combine together to make two layers, lipid bilayer. Okay, so this is the lipid bilayer made by the phospholipids. Now the inside part is basically lipids and the outside part is basically phosphate. So inside part is hydrophobic. As you know, lipids are hydrophobic, and the outside part is hydrophilic, water loving. Okay, so what is the significance of this phospholipid layer? The main significance is that fat soluble substances can easily pass through this phospholipid bilayer. Okay, fat soluble, so which are the famous fat soluble substances? Oxygen, carbon dioxide, alcohol. They can easily pass through this lipid bilayer, whereas the water soluble substances, and even the water, they cannot cross this lipid bilayer. For example, different ions, glucose or urea, they are transported via these integral proteins. Okay, so you have to remember these points, the significance of it. Then we have sphingolipids. So there are two words in it, sphingo and lipids. So sphingo is from sphingosine. So it, for instance, all the three types of the lipids are labeled in red and purple. Okay, the name signifies that the constituents of that specific lipid. So sphingolipids is made from sphingosine. Okay, they are present in the nerve cells in relatively greater quantity as compared to the other cells. So what is the function of sphingolipids? Sphingolipids have three functions. Number one is the protection. Second one is the signal transmission, as they are present in the nerve cells. So signal transmission. And the third one is the adhesion for the extracellular proteins. So extracellular proteins are attached to these sphingolipids. So number one is the protection, then is the signal transduction, and the third one is the adhesion for extracellular proteins. So these are the functions of sphingolipids made from sphingosine. Then we have cholesterol. So cholesterol. What is it? What is the sterol? So sterol, from sterol you can remember steroid nuclei, because they have steroid nuclei. Okay, now what is the main function of this cholesterol in the cell membrane? So the main function is it helps determine the degree of permeability. Okay, so it is often asked in the MCQs that which of the following substances will determine the permeability of the cell membrane. So the right answer is cholesterol. Cholesterol determines the permeability, degree of permeability of the cell membrane. Okay, whether the cell membrane is more permeable or it's less permeable, that will depend on the amount of the cholesterol in the cell membrane. Okay, so these were proteins and the lipids. Now let's discuss the carbs. Okay, now the carbohydrates. Now carbohydrates. Where are the carbohydrates? Let's zoom in. Okay, now these are the carbohydrates. Now on the outside of this is the lipid bilayer. These were the proteins. On the outside of the cell membrane is carbohydrates. Now, these carbohydrates are not present separately. They are present attached with the proteins or the lipids. When they are attached with the proteins, they form glycoproteins or proteoglycans. And when they are attached with lipids, they form glycolipids. Okay, now, so what is glycocalyx? One of the very famous thing usually asked in exams is glycocalyx. Now, what is glycocalyx? Glycocalyx is basically a loose carbohydrate coat outside the cell surface. Now, outside the cell surface, there is a loose coat of carbohydrates that is known as glycocalyx. Now, what is its significance? Its significance is that it can act as receptors, as in the case of famous insulin receptors. Then it can also act in the immunity. Glycocalyx, the third function is that glycocalyx provides attachment for different substances. And the final one is that glycocalyx has negative charge, so it repels the other negative charged substances. Okay, so I'm going to revise it again. Glycocalyx is basically a loose carbohydrate coat outside the cell surface, which has a negative charge, so it will repel the negative charge things. It provides attachments. It acts as receptors for the substances like insulin, and glycocalyx also plays its role in the immunity. Okay, so this is it. This was cell membrane. This is a very important topic. Do revise it. Okay, so this is it. See you in next part.